as possible, and to Dr. Mina Bose, the director of the Calico Center, who has made this event possible, this symposium. My name is Philip Dalton. I am an associate professor in the Department of Rhetoric. I'm the chair of the Department of Rhetoric, and my areas of interest are in public argument and political communication, which is what makes this symposium so interesting to me. This panel in particular, the title of which is "How Will the Use of Social Media in the 2016 Presidential Election Influence Political Deliberation and Policymaking?" It's an extraordinarily important topic at the moment. There are a lot of folks who, in the aftermath, which is kind of a judgmental term, but in the aftermath of the 2016 election, have become energized, both on the left and the right. And a lot of folks are using various forms of social media to communicate and network. And so there are good questions that emerge from that activity, such as, will that work? Will this amount to anything? I recall when I entered not graduate school, but my PhD program in 1996, that Ross Perot, I think it was around 1996, Ross Perot told us that the internet had held out this promise of electronic town halls, that it made available to us the ability to channel the electorate's interests, and that we would be able to translate that into policy. And I think we've had a lot of time since then where we can look back and see if we've accomplished that with this media, various forms of social media. And there are a lot of questions, additional questions that come to mind. Does social media help or impede the efforts of regular citizens to affect change? Does social media enhance or degrade the quality of our discussion about policy? And another question that came to mind as I was putting this together was, in light of Trump's manner of communication, can it be done wrong? Is it possible to do political communication with the public wrong via social media, in light of the fact that he has violated a lot of norms and conventions for appropriate public communication? To investigate these issues, it's my tremendous honor to introduce the following speakers. We have with us first Dr. Charlton McIlwain. He's the Associate Dean for Faculty Development and Diversity at the NYU Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development, and also Associate Professor of Media, Culture, and Communication. His research focuses on race and media in the political and social arenas. He's the author of Race Appeal: How Candidates Invoke Race in Political Campaigns. And his most recent research focuses on the intersections between race and social media. And his most recent projects investigate Black Lives Matter and Twitter. Our second speaker is Dr. Jennifer Stromer-Galli. She's a professor in the School of Information Studies and the director for the Center for Computational and Data Sciences at Syracuse University. She's a fellow at the Tow Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University, and has been recognized for her book, Presidential Campaigning in the Internet Age. Her current work is titled Illuminating 2016 Studies of the 2016 Presidential Campaign. This project studies the 2016 presidential campaign by collecting and analyzing candidate social media postings. So each speaker will be invited up to speak for about 15 minutes. Then I'll invite the Calico Center's Senior Presidential Fellows, Ed Rollins and Howard Dean, to speak for roughly 30 minutes. And then I'd like to open the floor up to you all to ask questions and engage the guests in discussion. So with nothing more, I'd like to introduce Dr. McIlwain.
Thank you, and thank you for all for coming this morning. I spent most of my career, at least more of my career, studying political communication, presidential campaign communication, more so than I have activism and so forth. But I wanted to talk from both of these vantage points today and address this broad question first about social media and its influence on political discourse, political deliberation. And so I'll start doing that, and then I'll jump to thinking about the question, social media, what is it good for, and talk specifically about activism in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement, and talk about basically some pros and cons of social media from that particular context. I want to start off, though, with a tweet. A tweet by our president and a few responses from those who came. And I'm going to read these. These won't be up on the screen. This is about Mark Cuban. Real Donald Trump. I know Mark Cuban well. He backed me big time, but I wasn't interested in taking all of his calls. He's not smart enough to run for president. This tweet has about 36,000 comments, 15,000 retweets, 80,000 hearts or loves or likes or whatever that represents. One of the first comments was by Vicky Trump. She says, liberals are some of the most arrogant, condescending, smart alecks, but they're just pure ignorant. And they fit the bill of people who have no love and no respect for the founding of this country. And her quote is attributed to Rush Limbaugh. Following that is Greg, who says, oh, at Real Donald Trump, Mark Cuban? Really? You sad fuck. Please get help. The crackage has begun to seep. Eddie responds, whether you agree with the president or not, please respect the position. Such language is not necessary. Greg responds, again, as soon as he respects the office of the presidency, the republic at large, and the Constitution, I'll act accordingly. As I said, there are thousands of comments. One of them ends with another quote and image about immigrants who are purported, 91% of them, to receive food stamps, 73% of them on Medicaid, 68% on welfare. None of this is sourced evidence in any kind of way. And so I use that and introduce my comments just to answer the first question. Is social media positive, good, useful, productive for public deliberation and policy making? And I would suggest to you that the answer to that question is no. As we've heard from the previous panel, social media is good for some things. It's not so good for others. And so in this context, the answer is no. With that out of the way, I want to move to talking mostly about and offering a few observations about what social media has been good for in a very different context, and that is in the sphere of activism and organizing, particularly around Black Lives Matter movement beginning around 2014. And much of what I'm going to talk about comes from a study that I did with two other colleagues that's reflected in this report called Beyond the Hashtags, where we analyzed more than 40 million tweets over the course of about 1 year and several different periods across the Black Lives Matter movement to try to understand both how the movement evolved, what impact it had, and how it accomplished what it did. And so looking at this research and the report very clearly shows a set of positives, a set of clear negatives about the power and the limitations of social media for activism, organizing, and influencing public deliberation and public policy, particularly around issues of racial justice, social justice, and about race in the criminal justice system. So what is it good for? One of the principal things that social media has become good for is for local communities, minority communities, people of color, African Americans in particular, to shape and define the narrative about their movement and about their community. And we saw this very powerfully in what we would call the birthplace of Black Lives Matter, which was in Ferguson, Missouri, where Mike Brown was shot and killed by a white police officer. And what happened was, in many ways, I think, earth-shattering might be too big of a word, but significant in terms of the way that news typically gets made and the way news cycles typically work, which is that reporters and news begins with the reporter. The narrative gets shaped by the person who is writing the story. They have sources, but ultimately the framing of the story, what gets covered, the facts, the evidence, everything that goes into the story is primarily the work of the journalist. In Ferguson, we saw something very different take place, and took place primarily because of social media. And so what I want to flip through very quickly, because we don't have time to go through it in great detail, but I want to call your attention to simply the timeline here. So Mike Brown gets killed early in the afternoon. And one of the first tweets documenting what happened we get from a young hip-hop artist in Ferguson, Missouri, who takes this photo outside or behind his window. The picture that you see in the distance is Mike Brown's body lying on the ground and the officer standing above him. And you can see the tweets that are coming here that detail what he has witnessed. What's also important to recognize is, for those of you that are on Twitter, know Twitter nomenclature and a little bit about the platform, the number and the volume of retweets associated with each of these posts that are coming early in the afternoon around 1 o'clock on August 9th when Mike Brown is killed. Here you see another tweet. This is the first tweet. We noticed that 4:05 p.m., so this is 3 hours later after that first set of tweets. This comes from a local news station. Notice that the retweet count is 107, right? So it's a local news station, but not circulated as highly or in greater volume as the previous tweet. Here you have another closer view of someone else who has witnessed Mike Brown's death. Again, the retweet count, the like counts, and the time frame. This is 7:42 p.m. So what I'm calling your attention to is really a timeline in the coverage of an event that begins to be noticed by people in the community, local community, and on a particular platform here, Twitter, and circulated widely by people who are highly networked in the Twitter environment. It's not until almost 8 p.m., we adjust for the time difference, or when you start to get reports from major news media, online media, traditional news media that are reporting online. And these are the first that come in that first evening of March 9th. So I'll flip through these quickly, and hopefully you'll get the gist of what I think is most significant here. Underlined in red, Mike Brown, unarmed teen, crowds talking about kill the police. Ferguson police just executed my unarmed son. You see the retweet counts. You see the other retweets that are happening over next to this. And these are the screenshots of the news stories that are reporting on this event in that evening of Mike Brown's death. August 9th, police shooting, Twitter users, another picture here, teenager. He has a name, Mike Brown, unarmed teenager. This is Mike Brown coming in late that evening. And so what I would merely suggest as I flip through all of these is that because in this particular instance, Twitter and those who were operating, engaging on Twitter, prefigured news reporting, what we saw happening is that when major news media did start to cover Mike Brown's shooting, their sourcing in that first 24 hours, really, almost entirely came from Twitter. Why is that significant? It's significant because those who were engaging then on Twitter, where these news media were sourcing their items, had a very particular framing about the events that took place, a very particular framing about Mike Brown. It is not insignificant to look at the almost uniform headlines that began to come out about Mike Brown that had two words almost uniformly, whether you're talking about non-ideological news, whether you're talking about news that has a vantage point from the left or the right, and those were two words, unarmed and teenager. If you think about the history of reporting about black men in America in particular, you'll know how significant this is. right? To think about someone who is 17 years old, and if that person had committed a crime, even if he had been 15, 14, 13, traditionally that person would have been labeled, tried as an adult. The fact that in this particular case, he is reported on almost uniformly as an unarmed teenager in a very significant way, I think shows the power of a kind of different way in which news began to circulate, in which local communities, network communities on Twitter were able to not only shape the fact of the coverage of Mike Brown, but the framing of his coverage that I think had ramifications down the road. So social media, what is it good for in the context of organizing and activism? In some instances, not in all, but in some instances, it allows local communities to have a voice in shaping the news in ways that traditionally they have not. What else is significant about social media in terms of positives and what social media allows activists to do? What we see here, and what I'll scroll through here, is a few network diagrams that essentially map out the different groups involved on Twitter amongst this volume of 40 million tweets over the course of the year. And essentially what it shows, and I'll scroll over to this particular moment, which comes, actually let me go back to this moment, which is the beginning of Mike Brown. This is March 9th through early September. And what's interesting to note here is that you don't see anything about Black Lives Matter in this network diagram. No one who is associating themselves with Black Lives Matter. There's a number of hashtags circulating at the time. Black Lives Matter is one. Justice for Mike Brown, hashtag Ferguson. There are many others competing. By the time we get to late fall, near December, you see that the bulk of the Twitter activity and the visibility and attention that's gained and garnered around Mike Brown's death, around Eric Garner's death in New York City, and others comes from folks who are associating themselves with Black Lives Matter in two very different camps. But the point here is also the fact that when we look around who else is involved in this network, entertainers, pop culture, journalists and activists, particularly those on the left, and many others, when we look at the degree of attention that Black Lives Matter was able to garner, they were able to do that because of the intense networking that social media affords, something that they would never be able to do offline, that would take tremendous resources, time, energy, money to be able to produce. And so this is one of the things that social media affords. And when I talk about visibility, Pew, up to the latest reports in the last summer of this year that I've seen, or of 2016, shows that Black Lives Matter is essentially a household word, a household phrase, right? From the left, right, Republicans, Democrats, everyone knows Black Lives Matter. More than that, everyone, or at least a majority, know what Black Lives Matter stands for or means, or what the message of the movement is, and that is to identify a relationship between black people, people of color, to the criminal justice system. To be able to have that kind of effect on attention is significant. I'll also point out one last significant outcome of Black Lives Matter that is a result of the attention that they were able to garner largely through social media, and that is affecting some modicum of public policy, at least in principle. And so what I'm pointing to is that if you look at the Republican Party platform, the Democratic Party platform in 2016, compared to all years back to at least 2000 and probably even before, Democrats typically, prior to 2016, will have a paragraph, maybe two paragraphs that talk about race, racial injustice, discrimination, equal opportunity. Republicans, maybe a sentence or two. In 2016, you saw the Republican platform with probably a couple of paragraphs talking about these issues. And you had probably a full page in the Democratic Party platform outlining in very detailed ways a stance and policy outlook about issues related to race and discrimination and equality and so forth, largely, I would say, as a result of the attention that Black Lives Matter was able to garner, and that attention they were able to garner largely through social media. So very quickly, I'm sure I'm coming up to my time, right? What is social media not good for in the context of movements and organizing? It's not good for sustaining a conversation. So if you look, you'll see this is the period that we covered in this Twitter study. And you'll see that there are peaks and there are valleys. Those peaks and valleys correspond to something very simple. It's when someone has gotten shot or otherwise brutalized by the police. This is when the bulk of Twitter activity takes place by Black Lives Matter movement and others that are involved. But what happens when that curve of attention begins to wane, when we get to that valley, we're not able to sustain a dialogue and discussion and attention to that issue without having some other catalyzing event, which in this case is unfortunately someone's death. Right? So social media does not seem to be able to help us sustain a conversation and attention to a particular issue outside of a given incident. And then lastly, I will simply say that the last thing that Twitter in particular and social media in general is not good for is simply that it has become a toxic environment. So as I talk to many who are involved and are at the forefront of the Black Lives Matter movement, they will simply say that this is not the place where we can have a discussion. We can circulate information, we can call attention to things, but I'll never forget talking to a prominent activist, media producer. Her name is Dream Hampton, very sophisticated woman who talked about an incident where she said, you know, it used to be when I was on Twitter, people would gaslight me and start some kind of a confrontation about a piece of information that I circulated, a news story that I commented on. And it was clear from what they said that they hadn't read the news story. Touche, we know we have diminished attention and so forth. She said, I got off Twitter, finally, because people did not even have the attention span to read my 140-character tweet before they gaslit me and started some kind of public confrontation that was massive and then yielded national news stories about. So simply the attention wasn't there, that Twitter in particular had become a forum for trolls and others, and simply that it has become a space where organizing activism for folks like these simply could not be done. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles.
Okay, good deal. First of all, thank you, Philip, for inviting me. I am honored to be here at Hofstra University. One of my former PhD students, Christina Wu, is now an instructor here, and I'm delighted to be able to come and see who it is that she interacts and teaches with. So I'm Jenny Stormer-Galley, and you've just heard Professor McElwain provide, I think, a really astute observation of the important power dimensions that social media potentially plays, especially around destabilizing institutions in important ways, in this case, the news institution, by opening up the possibility for new voices to be heard and different agendas to be pushed. My story is not quite as positive. So a couple years ago, I published this book, Presidential Campaigning in the Internet Age. And what I was interested in understanding is the history of how presidential campaigns, such as Governor Dean's, was using social media as part of the work of campaigning to understand whether or not the public was being engaged in new, more democratic ways because of the power of social media and the properties of digital technologies. So if the question that Philip originally posed to us was, is social media democratizing? I think part of the way to get to the answer to that question is to look at the longer history of information media, the news media, which we heard earlier, to understand a little bit about the affordances, which help us understand why we're even asking the question in the first place. To put another way, why are we asking, is social media democratizing? Because what's underneath that? So let me unpack that just a little bit. So this is not my diagram. I can't draw to save my soul. Not that this is much better, but nevertheless. So in the mass media era, right? So this is 1950, well, it's actually before that because we did have print. But anyway, let's say broadcast era, 1950s to the 1990s, communication technologies were one way, top down. Elites, the print institutions, broadcast institutions, people in power had the disseminating force of mass media to spread their message and ideas to the mass public. And so in that structuring, there's not much opportunity for ordinary people to push back, to have a voice, to change agendas. The internet, I don't know how many of you have ever seen this picture. This is J.C.R. Licklider's vision, sort of his dream of what the internet might be back in 1960s. So the galactic network is the image there on the far right for you guys. The idea here of the internet is a fully distributed network, which means that there's no single point of power. When many, many people have access to this network and can communicate with many, many other people, the hope, and the reason why we are having this conversation today, is that the internet would destabilize these traditional hierarchies, would enable new forms of organizing and conversation and deliberation to happen. So that's why we're asking this question. Especially to me, this idea of interactivity. So to go back again to Professor McElwain's point, while Twitter allowed members of the Black Lives, well, ordinary members in a community to publicize an event that they saw as being a powerful injustice, and to be able to get eventually the power holders in terms of the news media to then talk about this and share this and then shift policy agendas, that's that power of interactivity in social media. The possibility for people to talk, but then in terms of deliberation, actual sustained engagement, not so much. In the context of political campaigns, which is again part of what my focus is, so if you think of political campaigns as another opportunity for the public to engage with each other around our most precious activity in a democracy or republic, as Mr. Rollins reminds us of, is the vote. Right? And so voting in the context of social media potentially means that ordinary people can shift agendas, can change the power discussions in ways that are potentially more beneficial for us as a little d democracy. Actually, I'm going to skip this. So, well, I don't know. Okay, so let me go back. So 1996 is the first presidential campaign that used the World Wide Web. This is Bob Dole's website. I wrote my master's thesis on Bob Dole's website back in 1996. So what's interesting to me about Dole's campaign is that they were fully committed to thinking about the internet as a mass medium. They completely sidestepped the interactive potential of the internet to allow people to email the campaign, to have a message board, to engage their supporters and the public in a broader discussion on policy matters. Instead, they saw the World Wide Web and the internet as just another mass medium. And then this guy comes along. So Governor Dean, so I was so excited, I finally got to shake his hand, right? So I've been stalking this guy forever. So when Dean ran his campaign in 2004, he got it. He was savvy. He hired a guy named Joe Trippi as his campaign manager. Joe Trippi was an evangelist for what the power of the internet could be to democratize and engage supporters in a way that would allow this crazy insurgent campaign from a governor from some state, nobody even knows where it is on the map. And part of how he did his amazing insurgency campaign, going from being dead last in the polls to being at the top of the polls in December of 2004, is because his campaign had a blog. Now, he had some other things going for him too, but the blog, in terms of social media, in terms of enabling his supporters to self-organize, to join and find others like themselves, to use some other technologies like meetups, to then organize offline, Howard Dean's campaign got it. He understood, and his campaign staff understood, that the internet allows ordinary people to invest and engage and be part of this campaign in new and interesting sorts of ways. But we know what happened, right? We never got a President Dean, did we? And so part of what's, some of the challenges for campaigns is that, unfortunately, when you sort of open up your campaign for ordinary people to get fully involved and invested, they're really hard to control. They're really hard to focus. It's hard to get them all on the same page doing what ultimately a campaign is about, which is to win. And so from 2004 to 2008, what you see is some of the staff who worked on the Dean campaign realizing that the best way to use the internet, social media, digital media, was to create their own internal social media tools, like the dashboard. Because then they could monitor what their supporters are doing, they could drive particular kinds of messages to those supporters, they could focus them and harness them in particular kinds of ways, and they could collect data on them. So you would know who your supporters are, who they talk to, how much engagement they've had with the campaign so far, who their networks of friends are, to then activate them. So the internet then for campaigns has become not this genuine opportunity to enable and empower ordinary people to get involved in the campaign and help maybe set some policy as well as the direction of the campaign, but really to control what it is that the public is doing with the campaign. So part of what the book argues is that campaigns use, or restrict rather, the full interactive capabilities of digital media so as to utilize other affordances, in this case surveillance and data collection, in order to help them ultimately win. Not an optimistic or little de-democratizing vision, I don't think, in terms of what campaigns are doing. Okay, so now we just survived the 2016 campaign. Part of the question that we wanted to understand this election cycle is, again, as social media continues to diffuse, especially Facebook and Twitter, in the campaign cycles, how might those platforms be used this election cycle? Is there hope for better democratization? So how did Clinton and Trump, and I could talk about all the candidates, but I'll just focus on those two characters today. So to answer this question of how it is this election cycle, given past election cycles, what it is the campaigns were doing, we collected all of the presidential candidates' Facebook and Twitter messages since they announced, sorry, look this way, that's why. We collected everything on Facebook, everything on Twitter that the candidates said, and we also collected from the public all of the comments on the candidates' Facebook walls and all the tweets at the candidates or mentions of the candidates. And then we categorized all those messages using machine learning on these categories, which I won't go into. But they focus on things like calls to action, advocacy messages where the candidate is talking about themselves, on their image or their issue. So image are things like, so when Donald Trump says he will become a great president because he's been a great business leader. That's an image sorts of message. If he says he's going to build a wall, sadly that counts as policy. We also look at attack, right? So how much are the candidates attacking each other? Are they criticizing the opponent? Again, on image and on issue. So what we see overall, and let me just pause and say that I deleted that slide, but if you've got your computer, if you've got a note, the website is illuminating, as in illuminating, .ischool.syr.edu. You can actually play with all the data that I'm going to show you today and look for yourself. If you really love Bernie, for example, you can go and see what he was doing on social media. Any event, so this is just looking at Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. This is from January of 2016 until Election Day, November 8th, 2016. And what we have here are that pie chart there at the top, the donut chart, the kind of lime green, that puke green color, that's calls to action. Strategic message, that's image, issue, attack, and advocacy. So again, those messages meant to construct the candidate's messaging. That's the purple. Conversational, which again, Clinton basically has none. Trump has a little sliver of conversational there. It's the orange. The conversational, this is only Twitter, and the question here is, are the candidates engaging with their supporters or whomever? So anybody who is tweeting at the candidate, do they reply back in some fashion? So that's what conversational is, and then informative are the yellow. So what you actually see is that overall, Trump and Clinton aren't actually that different on social media. Now, Trump is noteworthy because he actually was engaging in some conversation on Twitter. But on the whole, the volume is, or the distribution is relatively similar. What's noteworthy is the volume. So while we have this perception that Trump was he's the Twitter king, as it turned out, actually, Hillary Clinton was more active, her campaign was more active on Facebook and on Twitter in terms of volume of messages. So one of the questions that I've been interested in is how is it that campaigns are using social media to engage people and get them to get involved in the campaign? So that's what calls to action are. So these are just, what is it that the candidates are saying to try to get their supporters to retweet a message, show up at an event, give some money, and vote? We might expect, actually, that Trump, being the Twitter king, would be much more savvy about recognizing that what you can do with social media is ask people to do stuff. Buy your ties, or steaks, we've been talking about earlier. Show up at rallies, right? Watch him on debates, those kinds of things. But that's actually not what we see. So to unpack this little graph a bit, so gray is Hillary Clinton, gold is Trump, because that just seemed to make some sense. And this is, again, January to November of 2016. Clinton's campaign is producing substantially more calls to action over the course of the campaign than Trump's, and especially so during that very contested primary season between her and Sanders. When we look at votes, so at the end of the day, remember, part of what campaigns need to do is urge their supporters to come out and vote. Actually, Trump doesn't quite get it. So of the messages, what you see here, again, it's the same distribution, it's the same color scheme. Trump is gold, Clinton is gray, January to November of 2016. So during, again, that contested period, Clinton is very actively urging her supporters to vote during the primaries. And actually, this is California, the last little stand there. And then as you come into Election Day, what you see is that Clinton is producing almost twice as many messages as Trump in terms of urging people to vote. Now remember that Hillary Clinton actually won more votes. So this says to me that potentially, actually, Clinton was more successful on social media than her counterpart in terms of urging people to vote. And then just quickly, in terms of character construction, so attack and advocacy, there is this perception, for example. Well, let me ask you guys, who was more negative or attacked more on social media? How many of you would say that Clinton was attacking more on social media? I know I shouldn't show you that slide because I'm giving it away. How many of you would say Clinton was more negative on social media? How many of you would say Trump was more negative on social media? Every hand should go up. Okay, cool, good. So here's some fun. Fun fact for the day, you can take this back to your friends and family and say, look what I learned. So as you look here, this distribution is, again, attack and advocacy. Over the course of the campaign, from January to November, actually the volume of attack and advocacy is not, it's roughly even. That is, they are attacking and advocating at about the same rate. But when you look across the campaign over time, Clinton is substantially more negative on Facebook and Twitter than Trump is. So Clinton is red. Clinton is, Donald Trump is red. Hillary Clinton is purple. And again, what you can see over the course of the campaign is that, especially as you move into the general election season here, Clinton is substantially more negative. And I'll skip advocacy for now. She also advocates more as well, but she also attacks more. And I'll skip this one as well. So what's interesting to me, though, is that over the entire election season, if you include the surfacing stage, which is when the candidates announce, so this is September 2015 through Election Day, what you notice actually is that Trump is substantially more negative in that surfacing stage before the vote begins, and then his negativity drops. And I have a hypothesis that we're currently, working to test, which is that he used that negative surprise attack messages on social media to drive news coverage, giving him that surprise amount of news coverage, which helped give him momentum going into the votes. Okay. How am I doing for time? I can skip. I'm good? Okay. So we think of Trump as the Twitter king, but Clinton is actually more heavily using social media than Trump was. The one thing I would say is that while Clinton is more negative, her style is different. So she's more substantive than Trump is in terms of her negativity. But again, over the course of this election cycle, just like in 2012 and prior, campaigns are still using social media for controlled interactivity to try to focus and force people to do things that they want to do in order to win.
Thank you. Thank you both very much for those presentations. With regard to the question of the democratizing power of social media and the internet, we've got a little bit here to work with. I'd like to open it up to Howard Dean to give comment, and then Ed.
Sure. Two great presentations. Thank you very much. So a couple of reactions. I would agree that the contents of Twitter, if you have to have a conversation on Twitter, is toxic. I like Twitter a lot. I block anybody who doesn't have anything to say that is of interest, that is unsubstantiated crap. And so I've blocked a couple of thousand people, and I never read the people who answer my tweets unless I've asked them a question. Then it becomes a lot less toxic. I only follow 90 people, and half of them are news media organizations, and the other half, others than some friends who I know and like and trust, are people who are experts in their field. Jonathan Cohn, for example, I think is the best healthcare reporter in the country, and I follow him because he's going to, whatever he's going to say, I'm going to learn something. So I absolutely agree that Twitter is toxic, and the opinions it's nasty. I mean, it's just, it brings out the worst in people. People say things on Twitter they wouldn't say to your face. I have no interest in a conversation like that, so I just block them. And I actually think Twitter's great for that reason. But there's another reason that I think Twitter is incredibly important. That is the democratization. The Black Lives Matter thing and the Michael Brown thing was a perfect example. But this can happen mega as well. Now, it's not just Twitter, it's other social media. The Arab Spring was essentially begun by Egyptian kids having been witnessed by electronic media and others to the self-immolation of a Tunisian young person who was abused by the police. And they put up on, not so much Twitter, because Twitter really wasn't a thing then, but they put up videos, YouTube videos on smartphones, and maybe not so smartphones, that were of police shaking down kids, planting drugs on them, beating them up, killing them, so forth and so on. A whole series of abuses. And that's what began the Arab Spring in a serious way. Now, the interesting thing is they also used methods like going onto the subway in Cairo and holding up these little video things, and then everybody would watch, and they'd move 20 feet down the car and do it again. They also used taxi cabs. This is the mythology of, it wasn't all high tech. They discovered that the middle class people take taxis in Cairo because it's incredibly cheap and more reliable than the bus system. So and taxi cab drivers apparently in Egypt are great gossips. So they would say sotto voce, just above hearing level, into their cell phone, which wasn't connected to anybody, there'll be a meeting in the square after prayers on this Friday. And they knew they were getting somewhere with, after a long day of work, they'd get in the cab to go home, and they'd sit in back, and the taxi driver would drive along and say, there'll be a meeting in the square after Friday, prayers on Friday. They'd get the word out that way, too. So it's not just social media, but it is democratizing because the government is never going to raise the issue. Even in a relatively less corrupt place like the United States, the government is not going to raise the issue of abuse of law enforcement behavior and so forth and so on. And that was raised and was put front and center by the use of things like Twitter. A minor correction of my campaign. Ed has said before, and I don't want to take his lines away, but we discussed it at the last panel, and I think he's right, even though I confess that we're both sort of old school types because of our age. I mean, Ed got his start in politics managing Abraham Lincoln's campaign, which he doesn't say well.
Great campaign.
Yeah, it was a great campaign. The only president in American history that got off to a worse start than Donald Trump. Right? But what Ed said, I think, is absolutely true. Social media is incredibly important. Everything is changing, but it's the candidate that matters in the end. The reason we lost was not the scream speech. The reason we lost is because I was disorganized and I wasn't a candidate that was able to move to the center. And I made a lot of people nervous in the Democratic establishment. It was true. Bill Clinton thought I was a lock in December, and a month later, I not only wasn't a lock, but I was finished third in the Iowa caucus. The problem was finishing third when you're supposed to finish first, not the scream speech, which I think I could have gotten by, but it was the narrative that, of course, my opponents in the Democratic Party were pushing, which is this guy is too scary to be president because he's too committed and too passionate. And I'm a disorganized person. It was an unbelievably disorganized campaign because when you start and none of the big, well-organized people want to work for you except for 23-year-olds. When you just have a lot of passion but not much organization and nobody thinks you're going to win inside the Beltway. And although the only genius of the campaign was A, Trippi believed in blogs, and that did help a lot, and B, we actually did whatever the 23-year-olds told us to do, and it was incredibly successful, and it was their first successful campaign. But it was because I really wasn't, I was a great inspirer, but I was not a great candidate because I wasn't well organized, because I wasn't able to move back towards the center when I knew I was going to, or thought I was going to become the nominee. And so again, I think as important as social media is, ultimately is the candidate and the emotional connection. I had the emotional connection, but it wasn't a well-organized campaign, and that was a reflection of who I was. And I think Hillary's campaign was a reflection of, both of you have said, of who she was. And I adore Hillary, and I worked very hard for her. She would have been an incredible president, but she was not a great candidate. And I was actually surprised at how, I don't know much about the inner workings of the campaign. Ravi Mukh started out as my deputy in New Hampshire, and he rose like a meteor. I don't know what happened, because he certainly was one of those 23-year-olds that knew his way around social media. But I totally agree with both of your comments about the problems that they had with social media. But in the end, you've got to say that they did reflect who Hillary was, who was a policy. I'm a big fan of her, so I don't go for the stuff about her being, not consistent or whatever. But she is absolutely a policy wonk, and policy does not elect presidents. It's emotional connection. And Trump had that emotional connection, and then a lot of people who voted for Trump just wanted to change, and they knew they were getting somebody who was, I'm trying not to use the A word, who was difficult, interesting. But they wanted change, and they knew that Hillary wasn't the change candidate. A couple of other just quick remarks. This business of democratizing the news is incredibly important. It wasn't just because of the nature of the Tahrir Square stuff in Egypt. I think it is retransforming the media. The media, in my view, has more or less collapsed. I think it's a failed institution. I think they're finding themselves again because the competition of the New York Times is not the Washington Post. It's Twitter, and it's what's out there in the field. And not just Twitter, although that's what you set the agenda as, the very good framing. But it's all of this stuff. It's Facebook, it's all these other things. And so that has democratized the media. And the interesting thing is it does set the agenda for what the mainstream media then goes off. There's a fascinating study on fake news about a week or two ago that I looked at. And you guys probably know who it is, and I can't remember. But the interesting thing about fake news is the way to combat fake news is not to put out the truth and then try to overcome it. It's whoever gets there first leaves the lasting impression. Well, that is a rule of politics that's been there for 10,000 years, as long as there's been politics. Whoever gets there first with their message, whether it's true or not, has an enormous advantage. And I think that's part of the issue. Some of the fake news is deliberate, and some of the fake news is sloppy. But whatever it is, it gets there first. So I think that the issue of the mainstream media and the old line media is how do you catch up and have both integrity and getting there first? And they struggle with this. I think there's progress being made. The last thing I want to say is a sort of an interesting, hopeful note. you know, I couldn't stand the media when I was running for a variety of reasons, most of which I think were fair. That is, that they would write stories that weren't true, and they would say things that their editors want them. If anybody, you can still look at my book. It's out of print, but it's called "You Have the Power," and there's a whole chapter in there about all the stuff that the press did, which just wasn't true. Many of whom are now older, successful press people still writing things that aren't true. And it's not that they lied, it's just that they rearranged the story to fit their own needs, including selling books. I remember doing the book, and the publisher said, well, you're going to have, you know, some sex in the story. And I said, well, A, there probably wasn't much, and B, I'm not doing it. And if there is any, it turned out there was more than I thought, but but I wouldn't have put it in the book anyway. So, you know, they didn't want to publish the book unless I put all that stuff in. So we had this tussle about what was going to go in the book and what wasn't. I mean, welcome to the mainstream media. This was Simon & Schuster. No big surprise, since they just cut a deal with a right-wing Nazi for $250,000 because they thought they'd make some money out of it. I mean, if that's what's driving what you read, I think that's all fine and good for the First Amendment, but it doesn't do much for the country. And I think one of the problems in our country is corporations have forgot that they have a responsibility to the body politic, not just to the bottom line. They have forgotten that, and they better learn it again, or they'll have to find some other place to operate, because there won't be a country like America if they continue to be bad citizens. But the last thing I want to say is Bill Clinton once said to me when he thought I was going to win, don't read the Washington Post. It'll just demoralize your staff, and it'll make you mad, and none of it's true, and nobody reads it anyway, which at the time was totally true. And I haven't read the Washington Post for months and for years and years and years, because it's an inside the Beltway company paper, and inside the Beltway is like middle school on steroids, and, pss, 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 and nobody pays any attention to what goes on, and they're totally out of touch with the rest of the country. Jeff Bezos, who's not known as a nice guy in the business, who runs Amazon, bought the Washington Post. Didn't change anything I did. I had dinner with a guy who's been with the Washington Post for a very long time. He's a very, very smart columnist. And I asked him what it was like, and he said it was great. He said that Bezos was putting a ton of money in, taking a loss, hiring really smart young people, and really interested in good content. And actually, I think that's true. I think of all the print media in this country that did a decent job on the campaign, it was certainly not the New York Times, and certainly wasn't a lot of the other papers, but the Washington Post had a young guy named David Farnhall who actually wrote real journalism about what Donald Trump was about. And it wasn't hatchet, you know, he's grabbing people by the genitals and all that kind of stuff, which is a nice thing to know, and I wouldn't vote for him anyway, but that certainly wouldn't make me not vote for him. But the really interesting thing was the substantive, thoughtful, well-researched stuff by a guy who I'm pretty sure is not much more than 30 years old. And I looked at that and I thought maybe there's a way for the old-fashioned print media to come back from this moral morass they've been in for the last 20 years. Now, if the model is you have to have a billionaire come in and waste $300 million and never get the return, that's not going to work, because most people, billionaires, are not going to buy their own newspapers, except for Shelley Adelson, who basically has turned the Las Vegas Sun into a propaganda organization and destroyed its reputation, not that it had a big one in the first place. So there is hope. There is a model. It's not clear what it is, but I see the beginnings of a glimmer of a comeback in the print media, which of course is all going to be online by the time you guys get to be my age. It is fascinating. I would love to hear the comments of both Ed, who's one of the most experienced people, Lincoln joke aside, in the history of politics here, or you two guys who are excellent and academic experts in this, because I really think that there is a glimmer of hope among the mainstream media, and I would not have said that at any time in the last 15 or 20 years until today.
As everyone has said, I'm the old man here, but I have a 21-year-old daughter who kind of keeps me relevant. She doesn't call me like I used to call my mother. She texts me. But I'm just going to tell you a couple facts that I think you'll find very interesting, particularly you young people who live on the facts things. I read 14 newspapers a day. I've read newspapers all my life. I still read 14 newspapers a day. I read the same story 5 times and can't remember which one it came from. I basically, when my daughter, who just graduated from Mount Holyoke, was going to Ireland to study at Trinity University for a year, so I decided it was really important for me to get on Facebook so I'll know what was going on. all of a sudden I had 5,000 people who are my friends who are having been, I mean, seriously, having been around the game for a long time, I didn't know whether friends or not friends, but 5,000 was the quota, that was the maximum. I was trying to find my daughter. She was an intern at Goldman Sachs that summer, and the 3 or 4 interns had a picture there, and I commented on her picture, and I said, basically, I love it. I said, here's the future leadership of Goldman Sachs. I was unfriended 35 seconds later. So all of a sudden, I have 5,000 people that are allegedly my friends who have to give me advice and counsel every single day about what, again, not knowing whether they're relevant to my life or not, what have you. And I expanded. So then I had about 25,000 friends. So then I unfriended my friend. Well, then his former campaign manager, he said he's down to 90 people that he follows. Joe Trippi and I do about 5-6 shows a week together on Fox. Joe has 1 million followers on Twitter. Howard challenged that one time. He looked it up and discovered he had 1 million. I have no followers. I'm on television 14 times a week, and I basically, to me, I want it to be one way. If you want to hear my opinion, you can turn on Fox and you get my opinion. I don't want your opinion. I don't want you to send back to me 15,000, you idiot, you asshole, you huge asshole. I don't care about that. I'm an old man. I don't have to listen to that anymore. The point of saying all that is communication is a two-way thing. And it's funny, with my generation, I'll send someone an email, who's a lawyer, what have you, and I won't get the email back. And I'll call the secretary and I'll say, he hasn't responded to my email. She said, well, I just printed them out and put them on his desk. He hasn't read them yet. You all read them quickly, you fire them back immediately, what have you. But there's a whole generation, your parents, others, that are basically into the social media, but aren't yet. But equally as important, I was the chief strategist, and I don't want any booze on this, but I was the chief strategist and the chairman of the Great America PAC, which was the largest Trump PAC. I said I didn't want any booze. It's a democracy, it's an educational institution, and I'm a nice man. I may have been a little misguided at times in my life, but we have 30 million followers on that PAC. We raised more money than anybody else, and our people said, let's keep it alive to help get some of the Trump agenda through. I got a call last week from senators where we basically send to our people, send your emails to the senators, the congressmen, to get the cabinet through. I got a call from some people in the leadership saying, don't send us emails. Nobody on the Hill reads emails. We count calls. We don't count emails. And I said, well, you don't listen to the calls. They said, no, we have people that pick up the calls and go, yes, no, yes, no. And I compare this to 20 years ago when I went to the Hill one time when I was in the White House lobbying for something. They said, well, and I said, we bombarded you with calls. They said, well, we don't pay any attention to the calls. We don't have any mail. And I guess what I'm saying to you is whatever the potential is, the problem with email, if you get 15 million emails, you don't read them. You sort of have a flow and you have an understanding of that. And before you have real power, you've got to make sure it's a two-way street, that someone's reading the other end of it. I always remind people that the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey is closing, as you may know, the circus, the great circus. And it's not because of the mistreatment of elephants, it's the lack of attention. Maybe they knew that Trump was coming to Washington. They didn't want the competition with another circus. They couldn't compete with it. But at the end of the day, one of the reasons Ringling Brothers, and I'm sort of someone that's always paying attention to what's happening in the society so that I know what you people are thinking or others are thinking. The biggest problem with Ringling Brothers and Bailey, it used to have a 3.5-hour show. And then they discovered that they couldn't keep the attention span. The acts used to be 10, 15 minutes, lions, trapeze, whatever. The attention span now of the viewers, the young people, is 6 minutes. So they cut it down to 2 hours. They cut it down to whatever. They had to have more acts. It became more and more expensive. They had to raise the price of the tickets so they didn't get people. But the point I want to make is if you can't watch a circus act for 6 minutes, trapeze artists, lions, elephants jumping off of hoops, what have you, you have to think in terms of how do you communicate in a way that makes people read it. The magic of Trump was not, and I was an old school guy that was appalled by, he would call someone an asshole. He's a wimp, he's this, he's that. And I'd say, God, that's not going to work. That's insulting. Every day he gets up and it's some stupid comment. She's a jerk, he's an idiot, she's ugly, he's stupid. And there's millions of people who want to basically pay attention to that stupid little message. And I thought initially, I said, this is crazy. He's basically breaking up. I'm a communication strategist. He's breaking up the communication lines and what have you, the whole messaging. I was on Charlie Rose's show the other night, and Maggie Haberman, who writes for the New York Times, was one of the guests on the show, and we were talking about the first couple weeks of Trump's administration. And she's there with her gadget like this, and she goes, and Flynn hadn't been fired at this point in time. She said, well, I just got a thing from Kellyanne Conway saying the president totally supports it. So I said, fine. I said, well, I guess that's the decision. She goes, oh, no, I just got a thing from Sean Spicer saying the president does not totally support him. The decision has not been made. So then someone else writes, no, the decision's still not made. The president is really concerned about this. He's really outraged. Now, I thought that was kind of absurd, all in the course of a minute and a half. Then we had to go on Charlie Rose and talk about it. But I said last night on Lou Dobbs' show, I said, and he asked me, why did Flint go? I said, I don't know. I've heard the White House say he quit. I heard the White House say he was fired. I heard the White President say I loved him. He was a great guy. I heard another one where the president fired him because he was inept. I don't know. There's 5 messages out there. My only point is there's so much clutter out there, and how do you break through the clutter, and how do you really know what's true? I'm all for the social media. I think it's fabulous. I think it's wonderful. I spend a couple hours a day on the internet chasing things. Unfortunately, I'm in a point in my life where I don't have much else to do besides read 14 newspapers and serve my clients. And the way I serve my clients is by knowing what's in the newspapers. Makes me sound smart and wise because they don't read newspapers anymore. And so the reality is there's so much out there, so much clutter, and how do you break through the clutter? And that's the key here. I can tell you as a strategist, where running a major national campaign, I would have to argue with the mail guys who want a certain amount of money for this, the media guys who want so much for television, the radio guys who want so much for this, the field guys. Now you have one more of the digital people in there arguing, saying, we need X. Television doesn't work. We need $25 billion for digital. And it's sort of like, I always say, a person who runs a campaign like I do, I'm like the general contractor. It's better to hire a general contractor who doesn't have it. If you hire a plumber to be your general contractor, you get more toilets and sinks and no lights. If you hire an electrical contractor, you get all kinds of lights but no toilets. And you need someone who basically can take the budget, look at the plan, develop it, and move forward. In the course of a campaign like this one that was back and forth, and you began with Hillary being the inevitable nominee and basically had to struggle through a primary, had to struggle through a general, and lost it on election day. I mean, literally lost it on election day. And the reality was everybody will lay claim that I made the difference. And I think there'd be 25,000 books written and magazine articles written about this election, and there'd be 250 probably right here at Hofstra, a PhD and master's thing saying this is what happened. I don't think any of us knew what happened except, and none of us ever will know what happened, except the world was changing out there. The national media didn't capture the unhappiness that was going on. Obviously, Hillary didn't talk to it. Trump, for some reason, caught that element of people who, you drive through. I had to go to Harrisburg in Pennsylvania, and I said to someone, my friends in Pennsylvania, said, there's no way you can't win Pennsylvania, you can't win Philadelphia, you can't win this. I said, yeah, but I'm driving across the farm country there. There's guys that dedicated their pickup trucks to make them a Trump sign. There's houses, there's something's going on out there. I ran Ross Perot's campaign for 8 weeks, which was like my trip to the wilderness was like about 5 months for me. Ross Perot was captured in 1992, and he was leading all 3 candidates. He was a movement, and he had a 1-800 number. He'd go on Larry King, and he'd say, you want me to run? Call my 1-800 number. I'm going to get under the hood. I'm going to clean out the barn. Those were his big policy statements, unlike building the wall and what have you. So I go in one day and I said, every week I get a request. I said, how many people do we have who call the 1-800 number? We had 6 million people. 6 million. I said, where are all those names? They said, oh, we've got them all on computer cards. And I said, where are the computer cards? They're all locked up in a vault. So I go into Perot. I said, you have a tool that nobody else has. 6 million people in 1992 who've said they want to volunteer, they want to send you money, they want to do something. Let's get mail out there. Let's get some way to communicate. I said, you think I'm going to waste 1 penny of my money on junk mail? I'm not. I know they're voters, and I got them locked up in the vault. I said, well, beyond voting for you, they want to help you. They want to send you money. They want to do whatever. My only point in all this is just simply all this stuff we have today, the information flow, all the rest of it. We have to figure out how to use it. And again, cutting through the clutter with these experts that we have here, people who have analyzed it, studied it, what have you, It's like you know, it used to be like when I was in the White House, I'd be in meetings all day long, and I'd come back to my office at 7, 8 o'clock at night. I'd have 400 phone calls, and I'd look through the list, and there'd be governors, there'd be congressmen, all the rest of it. And I had to figure out, I couldn't call all 400, obviously. I'd be there all night, which I was anyways. And no one was calling to say, gee, you guys are doing a great job over there. They're all saying, you bunch of assholes, why don't you, my power plant is. So you have to figure out a system, how you make sure those 400 that are important, including the 25 friends of yours who said Ed Rollins become a jerk since he got in the White House, he won't return my phone calls. Yeah, I've talked to him in 20 years, but at the end of the day, it's how you get through the clutter, how do you fix that? And that's the piece that's still not quite worked out. He talked about, he's narrowed his list to 90 people. Joe Trippi has 1 million. Joe Trippi threw me on his list one time, and I ended up with 500,000 Twitter people saying what a jerk I was because I didn't agree with Joe Trippi. I'm just simply saying this is a very complicated thing today. It's a great tool. It's a great way, all of you, but we have to figure out how to use it. Television is very decentralized. It's still very powerful. There only may be 3 million people who watch Bill O'Reilly, but those 3 million people who watch Bill O'Reilly, they basically are there every night. And the advantage that Fox have, I don't say it because I'm on Fox, is Fox has the same drumbeat all day long. It's just, I don't care what time you turn it on, it's 1 million, 1.5 million all day long. It's 3 million at night. It's the same drumbeat. It's the same people on there. If people turn on Fox, they listen to Fox all day. CNN, they flip through. MSNBC, they flip through. They see somebody they like, they want to move on. 3 million people in an audience of 300 million doesn't sound like a lot. But if there are 3 million people who basically go out and advocate those positions, then it becomes a powerful tool. Equally as important, if you can get into social media, if you can get a variety of people who advocate your positions, it's a powerful, powerful tool, and it'll only get more powerful. But you've got to somehow narrow focus and drive the message when people are not interested in the messages. And the difference in newspapers today versus the old days, you used to have editors. Editors would basically say, the Abe Rosenthal's, the Ben Bradleys, they'd go through and they'd say, okay, you're reporting on that, who are your sources? There wasn't any misinformation because they would hold themselves responsible. They may have a slanted or point of view, but there wasn't the errors. Now there's all kinds of errors, and how do you not have errors when you get 3 sources out of the White House telling you 3 different things? So we're in an era of lots of stuff coming out there at you, and basically how do you figure it out is the real challenge ahead.
Thank you, Ed. I'd like to open it up to Charlton and Jennifer to offer any comment or reaction.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah. So I think my question back to my my colleagues here to my right is, when you take the long view, when you guys look back at the last N number of years that you've been in campaigns and politics, do you feel that we are in a qualitatively or substantively different age? In other words, there's a part of me that feels like I don't have the good terminology, but something is changing, right? There is a destabilization of traditional institutions and hierarchies, and that was made manifest this election cycle. But maybe I have got too short of a view and appreciation for that. So I'm just curious your thoughts of whether or not we're in, and again, there's got to be a better term.
It used to be if a candidate ever had above a 35% negative, meaning people disapproved of them, they had no chance whatsoever of being elected. And it used to be campaigns were pretty much all positive substance policy, what have you, and then they got so, all right, 35 is the mark, how do we raise it above that 35? And so the campaigns would end up running very negative ads in the end, going after a very small segment of the population. People had not made up their mind, which is about 15% of the population at that point in time. And you see the closing element of a campaign be extremely negative, and it was much easier to get people to go vote against somebody than to get them to vote for somebody. Then we reached a point where in the last election cycle, 85% of all ads were negative ads. So we now are at a point where both candidates this time were above, Trump was at 70%, Mrs. Clinton was at 65% negative. Yeah. It used to be that kind of went away, as I said earlier, after the election. Okay, that was an election, we don't pay attention to it. That stuff is now ingrained, and we now have this polarized society in which there can't be dialogue. You're seeing these, Trump today, the OMB director, got through on a 51-49 vote. the major people here, and this is a member of Congress, a very respected member of Congress. There's a polarization that's going on in the Congress. It's on judges. It's on everything else. And I think to a certain extent, I expect, and I think if Mrs. Clinton would have been elected, it still would have been the same on our side. The two parties that represent a smaller and smaller segment of the electorate and a smaller and smaller segment of the society are so polarized today. There used to be Northeast Republicans who were moderates. There used to be Southern Democrats who were conservatives. There's none of that anymore. Democrats are to the left. Republicans are to the far right. Democrats mainly represent big urban areas. Republicans represent suburban, rural areas. And there's a polarization, and what they worry about is not getting along with each other. It's I can't get so far to the left or to the right, but I get primaried. And it's all about getting reelected. So the political system today, I think, is broken. I don't know how it gets fixed in the short run. You always hope a new president will fix it. This one obviously is not going to fix it because his policies and to take care of that base that wants the wall, that basically wants the pickup truck to basically be replaced by a Mercedes because all the Wall Street types have that. You're going to find extensive, tough rhetoric for the next 4 years. I mean, I go to dinner parties in New York. The day I came back from the inaugural, I was invited to a dinner party in New York, and my wife and I were the only ones that obviously voted for Trump. Good friends, favorite people. I mean, I'm used to being the only Republican. I'm called a Republican in New York. I get invited to dinner parties so people can trash me. And so I'm not, I come back, one professor said, you're used to this battering. I said, I get battered all the time, it's no big deal. At the end of the day, I walk in this dinner party, people say, well, how long is before he gets impeached? I said, my God, he just got inaugurated yesterday. Well, he's going to get impeached. And that's the dialogue goes on now. We're going to impeach him. We're going to throw him out. We're going to put him in jail. Stories yesterday about Flint. This is the equivalent of Watergate. I lived through Watergate. Watergate went on for a year. And there was all kinds of criminal injustice. This is not Watergate. This is long ways from Watergate. But there's always this sort of like, how do we change the system? Kind of the big battle over the justices. It's unfair what happened to the one that Obama went up, so we're not going to let this guy be in. It's an ugliness in politics that I've not seen. And I know enough from reading history, what have you, that's not the first time it's ever happened. But I think there's a polarization today that's going on. It's not good for America. It's not good for young people who are going to have to inherit this whole world.
Governor Dean, I'm curious your thoughts as well.
Well, I'm modestly more optimistic. I think there is a huge change going on, and that is mostly as a result of demographics and of the internet. The internet has weakened institutions dramatically. Your generation doesn't need institutions very much, so you thought. Turns out you do, but you have more power than you can possibly imagine. It took us 7 years of marching around the Pentagon to stop the Vietnam War. It took you 3 days to make Verizon stop charging people for paying their bill online, 40 days to make Bank America stop charging you for debit cards, 3 days to kill the only intellectual property bill that was bipartisan that the Senate put out. Now, these are not ending the war, but your ability to marshal people on an ad hoc basis of the internet is incredibly powerful. I'm not going to tell the whole story now, but basically I know an 18-year-old, because I was judging an internet contest, and her project was, she went to LaGuardia High School, then she went to the University of Vermont, she went to South Sudan at age 18, concluded that American foreign aid made people more dependent, not less dependent. Now, if we'd done that in my age group, we would have come back and wanted to run for Congress or join USAID and change things and spend our career changing them. She went online, found a foundation in New York that gave her $1,000, got a roommate or a friend from across the hall to help her, and today she's 27, she runs $1 million a year foundation, has 100 African university graduates in Rwanda, Uganda, and Burundi, and has changed 10 or 15,000 lives and fundamentally changed the way the rural villages are governed and empowered women. I mean, she's 27 years old. So why would you be involved in institutional anything if you could start your own institution and do this, which you can? And there are thousands and thousands of people your age that have done things like this. So what's happening is the old institutions are crumbling, and they've yet to be replaced by the new ones. But the old ones are beginning to change because as you get older, it turns out that you do need institutions. That they're big, they're clunky, they value their existence over their mission. There's a lot of bad things about them, but the truth is it's the only way that you can that you can pursue a mission that's bigger than yourselves and it's going to last longer than you're alive, or than you're able to be interested in it. So I'm optimistic. I think we're going through a very difficult period. I agree with everything that Ed said. But I think institutions are going to change dramatically. And I also think this is a global issue. I mean, I think that the profile of the Trump voter is very similar to the profile of the Brexit voter. The same issues. I mean, Brexit was passed because Nigel Farage demagogued the hell out of immigrants, and it was a racist campaign, and that's why it passed. And there was a certain amount of that in Trump's campaign as well. So the hope, though, that I have is that you have such energy and such ability, and you're much more pragmatic and less ideological than we were, that I think there's a good chance that things are going to get much better as a result of this incredible turmoil that's going on all over the world because of the empowerment of your generation. Here's what I worry about. The big thing that I worry about, and this is, Ed and I were talking, we talk a lot because we've been doing this for 9 years and we've become really good friends. The big thing that I think we both worry about is the lack of leadership. You don't see in politics very much. For example, I think the Republicans should have an investigative committee to find out what Mike Flynn knew and what he didn't know. But I don't think that, I'm not so sure the Democrats would have to do that if it was a Democratic president that was in this kind of trouble. So, I remember in Watergate, there was lots of politics and there was plenty of dirty stuff going on. But there was a certain statesmanship among some people. Bob Dole, who was one of the most partisan Republicans, went to Dick Nixon and said, Mr. President, we've come to the end of the line, you have to resign. And there were some other very senior Republicans who stood up and did what was good for the country before they gave a damn what was good for their party. If we don't, and it's not just politics, I think corporate ethics is at a low, except for the new companies, some of the Silicon Valley companies, not all of them. Some of the, Uber, for example, they were forced by you to do something that you wanted, which was to stop supporting Trump and the immigration stuff at the Kennedy Airport thing. And so there was a penalty that you exert on the corporations to become more socially responsible. And there are new corporations that are socially responsible. Some of them are for profit, some of them are not. But in general, I think business leadership has been really crappy for the last 20 years, too. It's been all about, look at the Wall Street collapse is a perfect example of what happens when you may stay within the law, but that doesn't make you a good citizen. That may change. And again, in people your age that start corporations, most of them are pretty good. In fact, the B Corporation actually came out of the notion that you can do good as well as make money. So that's the big question I have is, can the United States survive with the one thing I'm not sure about yet, and that is, are there still people in leadership positions who are willing to do the right thing even though it disadvantages their side of the argument? And until we know that that's happened, we're not out of the woods. I think we will be out of the woods on the institutional stuff. I think it's going to be ugly and messy and dislocative. It's one of the reasons Trump won, is because a lot of this change has disadvantaged a whole group of people who thought they were advantaged. Last thing I want to say is 2 books you ought to read. One is by a conservative, the other is by a flaming liberal. It's called Hillbilly Elegy, and the other one is Strangers in Their Own Land by Arlie Hochschild. They're both really, really interesting looks at the people who voted for Donald Trump. And Arlie, who I know, is, she's a flaming liberal from San Francisco. She lived in the Bayou country in Louisiana. She actually is very sympathetic she's horrified by their politics, but she's very sympathetic with them as human beings. I know a lot of those people, because anybody who campaigns in any state for any office, you meet people like this. And it's a great understanding of what it is that is driving all this stuff all over the world. And I think those of us who are quote unquote elite, which includes everybody in this room, because if you're going to a college like Hofstra, you're going to end up in some better position than most of the folks you're going to read about. We have an obligation to redesign the world so that everybody benefits from globalization, not just some people. And that, I think, will reduce the polarization and the anger.
Charlton, I hope you'll forgive me. We have 5 minutes left. I'd like to invite students who have questions to come to the microphones and ask. Yeah, the mic.
Anybody who has the courage to wear a Jets sweatshirt here can come down and someday. I'm 74 years old. I won't live that long, I'm afraid. I just want a quarterback.
I'm hoping for Romo. It's a long shot, but
Good
that's
shot.
besides the point. I can go on that. Yeah. I just have a quick question actually for you, Mr. Rollins. What was the deciding factor in, as I remember you came here a couple months ago and you were a little skeptical about Trump being the nominee. What was the deciding factor to say, okay, I'm going to support him and go far as to work for a super PAC?
I'm pretty much a Republican, and I've spent 40 years of my life working for the party, and I was hopeful that I could help alter the dynamics somewhat.
How's that working out for you?
Well, obviously, it's still a challenge.
All right, well, wish you luck with that. And that's about interesting. I also have another question for, I guess, Mr. Dean while you're here. I guess go ahead, if that's okay.
Sure.
Unless there's someone else. My bad. Yeah. Do you feel like when you had that moment, and I guess when you had that big, the yelling moment, do you feel in 2016 that would have had
The
a
I have a scream speech?
Yeah. Do you feel like if that happened today, there would be a little less of a negative reaction, to be more kind of like...
Yeah, I do. I think the rules have changed, and the stuff that went on in this campaign. I mean, I thought Trump was dead once a week for about 73 weeks in a row, and I was obviously wrong the whole time. I mean, the whole nature of campaigning has changed. Although the truth is, I mean, if this is what we don't talk about. We talk about Trump all the time. What we don't talk about is Hillary's campaign against a different opponent. Now, Hillary was going to win the nomination. Bernie Sanders was not going to beat her, and neither was Joe Biden if he had gotten in. But Joe Biden definitely would have beaten Trump, and I don't know if Bernie would have or not, because he was really not tested. Nobody threw negatives on him. So it's all woulda, coulda, shoulda. Standards change, and I think the standards have been are a lot lower.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I just have a question for overall for everyone. I have a question overall for everyone on the panel. Do you fear that Donald Trump's Twitter account will become its own entity? Because I feel like thinking about since his election, his Twitter account has kind of become like a second entity to itself. And I fear that people will drive their anger towards that instead of the man behind the Twitter account.
I wasn't expecting you to end there. That's interesting. So, I mean, part of what's interesting to me about the way that Trump's using Twitter, he's completely bypassed the traditional ways that the president and the presidency speaks, right? They generally speak through press conferences and press releases and through the news media. And Trump, by tweeting his opinions about what's happening in the political world, is bypassing, again, all of those institutions that we've been talking about in that destabilization. So, I think that people will continue to be either titillated or frustrated by the tweeter, not necessarily Twitter. Although I think there is an interesting question when you think about the affordances of Twitter. If we didn't have Twitter, would we have Trump?
Yeah, I'll just say, my pessimism to your question is really one that I saw before and after the election, like day after day before, with a number of folks who had essentially said, I'm done with Twitter. This is no longer a forum for kind of the engagement that I want. And then after, you faced a choice when it seemed like the place for conversation was going to continue to be Twitter, primarily because of Trump's use of Twitter. And so that's the kind of pessimism where we either face a choice of losing out and not engaging if Trump has the power to say this is where we're going to play ball. We're either out of the game or we're forced to play by the rules of Twitter, which, as we've seen, typically is not too conducive to public deliberation.
Thank you. Next.
So this is in regards to the Clinton campaign. So I've heard that they've tried out over 85 slogans for the Clinton campaign, and they end up with both Stronger Together and I'm With Her. And neither really seemed to catch fire at any point. What do you think was the failing with trying to find a slogan for her?
With what?
With the
With, like,
slogan.
Like trying to find one for her. Was it an
slogan.
issue with her, or was it
Right.
an issue with the campaign?
Yeah, great question. So the slogan, so Trump had his "Make America Great Again," or the shortcut, which was MAGA, MAGA, and then you have "I'm with her." And I think, rhetorically, and actually Philip probably has been thinking about this too, rhetorically, it's a really interesting difference. So Trump is "Make America Great Again," so it's about the people, the movement, right, that he's been building. Whereas Clinton's "I'm with her," that slogan actually makes it about her. And it shifts then the rhetorical footing on that slogan to then allow her to be attacked by Trump as saying basically, Clinton isn't running to serve the country, she's running to serve the Clintons, she's running to serve her interests. And so her slogan actually backfired on that. We actually, if you go to the Illuminating site, we did do a tracking over time of those two slogans as well as just mentions on Twitter. And it's interesting, on the whole, the "Make America Great Again" is there's much more activity on that hashtag, except for after the first debate. And at the first debate, there's a dramatic shift because she performed so well in that debate that I think there was a group of people who were like, you know what, I'm in with her, I'm willing to tweet on that hashtag and sort of say I'm in, and then it drops off again. So, slogans, and again, Philip, I'm sure thinking rhetorically, the slogans are important for campaigns. They do signify the campaign, and hers was, it symbolizes, I think, the larger failure of her campaign, which she didn't have a clear economic message. She wasn't in tune with what the needs of the public were. And so back to, it is the candidate and their message, and I think you're right in thinking about the slogans and where that failure of articulation was.
I'm going to agree with you. And we are out of time. So I want to thank you all for coming and thank our esteemed guests. I hope you found this edifying.